take a giant step for mankind.
Moonraker became a huge commercial success, and without taking the inflation into account, it was the most financially successful Bond film up until that point, and it remained to be so for many years. But a lot of the fans and critics didn't like the absurd, outlandish course the series had taken. If the filmmakers were to go down this path again, it would just get even more over the top than it already became. So there was only really one direction to take 007 in next. Bond needed to be brought back down to earth. Ah, the 1980s, the era of synthesizers, pastel colors, the boombox, cocaine and the first video games. The world was changing and so was cinema. The filmmakers felt Bond should be brought back to being more character and story driven like in From Russia with Love, rather than relying on set-piece fireworks like they did in the previous movie.
The characters seem more realistic, even the baddies, and there isn't the gadgetry. The stunt work's terrific.
No, I'm delighted with this one. The fact that the villains are more recognizable as ordinary human beings. They don't want to build empires in space or under the ocean.
So the filmmakers turned to John Glenn, who had been working on a lot of the previous Bond films, to direct the next entry in the series, and he would continue to do so throughout the entire decade. Cubby Broccoli's stepson, Michael G. Wilson, was also getting more and more involved with every Bond film, now working as an executive producer. Cubby was already thinking ahead of his eventual replacement. For Your Eyes Only was going to be the 12th installment in the Bond franchise, and it would feature an original story with plot elements taken from Fleming's short story with the same name, along with elements taken from the short story Risico, among other work of Fleming. Roger Moore was originally contracted to do 3 Bond movies, and his contract would then end up being renewed on a film-to-film basis. The filmmakers did consider to replace Moore here, but he was a very popular Bond, and they just ended up asking him back every time.
But people are still sort of offering me money, a lot of money, to play pictures. Must be mad.
Julian Glover.
By the music of the gun barrel alone, you can already tell that we've entered a whole new decade here. The film starts out surprisingly with Bond visiting the grave of his wife who got killed in Majesty's. It even has the inscription, "We have all the time in the world" on there.
There's no hurry, you see. We have all the time in the world.
It's a great little nod to Bond's past and a little reminder that we're still essentially watching the same character. Bond is quickly picked up by a helicopter which supposedly would take him to the office, but it turns out that the helicopter is actually sent out by Blofeld, or, well, at this point of the franchise the filmmakers had no official rights to the character of Blofeld anymore, as the rights were under the ownership of Kevin McClory at the time, so he is credited as the bold villain in the wheelchair, but he has a white Persian cat, he's bald, and he seems to have dealt with Bond in the past, so everybody knew exactly who he was supposed to be. The filmmakers even confirmed that he was indeed supposed to be Blofeld last year, now that they do have the official rights again. Anyway, Blofeld remote controls the helicopter and lets it fly over various parts of London. Of course, Bond eventually takes over the controls again and picks up Blofeld in his wheelchair, who starts to beg for his life.
I buy you a delicatessen in stainless steel!
A delicatessen in stainless steel. It's a line that has puzzled many fans throughout the years, but it's supposed to be a little nod reeking back to the early mafia gangsters who apparently would bribe people offering a delicatessen on stainless steel countertops because it's easier to clean and it's less bacteria laden as opposed to offering food on a wooden plate. But it makes so little sense. I'm sure these bribes were made in early days, but it's definitely not something you ever hear wise guys or mafiosi talk about in mobster movies, and that's coming from a guy who is a huge fan of gangster films. And besides all that, Blofeld isn't even part of the mafia. It's just such a confusing line. But anyway, Bond throws him down the chimney, and with that the filmmakers showed they didn't really need Blofeld to still be successful, as a big symbolic fuck you to Kevin McClory. The pre-title sequence is really silly and anything but serious or down to earth as this movie was aiming to be, but it's just a little standalone mini adventure that has nothing to do with the rest of the movie, and I do like the symbolic meaning behind the disposing of Blofeld and the reference to Bond's wife. Anyway, the title song is performed by Sheena Easton, and I might be controversial here, but it's honestly one of my favorites.
For your eyes only can see me through the night.
The song was nominated for an Oscar, and it was the only title sequence to feature the singer's face in it, and I kinda like that. The plot starts out with a seemingly old fishing boat, the St. George's, which secretly turns out to be a British covert spy ship, which has the most high-tech, state-of-the-art 80s technology hidden aboard. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see a Commodore 64 or a Sega Genesis in this room. But the most important piece of technology which they have aboard, and what half of the movie is based around, is the ATAC, the Automatic Targeting Attack Communicator, a system used to coordinate British submarines and fire ballistic missiles. So it's an important device that should not fall into the wrong hands, say the Russians, who are of course eager to get their hands on one. And then an old mine crashes into the St. George's and the ship is about to sink, and of course the crew members don't manage to self-destruct the ATAC system, thus leaving the device up for grabs. And then we are introduced to the main Bond girl, a Greek chick by the name of Melina Havelock, played by Carol Bouquet, and she's going out to visit her parents on their yacht. Her father, Sir Havelock, is an important marine archaeologist who secretly works for MI6 and is asked to locate the sunken St. George's. So they seem to be one big happy family who also own a parrot which repeats everything they say, and it's clear that they are very close to each other. But then Melina's pilot turns out to be a Cuban hitman, Hector Gonzalez. And so, the plot kicks off. And I love the emotion and revenge-driven fury that Bouquet conveys in her eyes. She's only been briefly introduced here, but already she has a deeper and more interesting backstory than half of the Bond girls we've had up until this point. So Bond is brought into the office, and he does some mandatory awkward attempt of flirting with good old Granny. I know it's the beloved Lois Maxwell and all, but this stuff is really just capped in for the sake of tradition here, instead of, actually being fun and playful like the old days. Anyway, M is on leave because Bernard Lee unfortunately passed away during production of this film. So out of respect for the actor, they didn't want to get an immediate replacement. So M's chief of staff, Bill Tanner, is here giving Bond's mission instead, along with the Minister of Defense, who returns once again. And Bond is informed about the sinking of the St. George's with the ATAC aboard and the killing of the Havelocks. So he must try to retrieve the ATAC and find out who hired the Cuban hitman, and he is sent out to Spain, sporting his White Lotus Esprit from The Spy Who Loved Me again. This time it's the turbo version. So Bond soon locates Hector Gonzalez at his mansion, having a nice 80s pool party. Yeah, you like that hot chick walking towards the camera here, huh? Yeah. Well, she's a dude though, just throwing that out there. A mysterious guy is paying off the hitman for killing the Havelocks, and Bond is soon captured.
Take him away.
The killing of the hitman on the diving board is taken from Fleming's short story, and I really like that bit. This movie has so much clever novel references throughout, and you just have to appreciate that. So Bond escapes and is soon teamed up with Melina Havelock, who killed the hitman with her crossbow, and they quickly run off to Bond's Lotus, which blows up. And this is symbolic of not having the over-reliance on gadgets for a change, but having Bond rely on his own wits. So he gets to Melina's car instead, an old bright yellow Citroen, and despite this really begging to be another one of those stereotypical tacky Roger Moore Bond action sequences filled with corny gags, it doesn't go too much into that direction at all. Sure, there is the parasol jump beforehand and some occasional flipping of the car and stuff, but at least there is not a raccoon doing a double take or the Citroen transforming into a freaking hovercraft or anything. Honestly, the scene is great. When Bond takes over the wheel, we get some amazing stunts and there's a great flip. It's a blast to see Bond drive this little thing. And I also really love the typical 80s soundtrack that goes with it all. Bill Conti did the score for this movie, and lots of Bond fans really disliked the score, but I couldn't disagree more. Come on, man, it's Bill Conti. I mean, the guy did the freaking Rocky theme. I adore this movie soundtrack. Maybe it's just because I really like the 80s or something, but to me it just really fits the time. And Bond and Melina managed to shake off the goons and go to a quiet hotel. Melina did end up killing the guy that killed her parents and all, but she still wants to kill the people that hired Gonzalez.
The Chinese have a saying: before setting out on revenge, you first dig 2 graves.
I don't expect you to understand. You're English. But I'm half Greek. And Greek women, like Electra, always avenged their loved ones.
Again, more elements taken from the novels that also really set up Melina as a very interesting character. I honestly think she's the most interesting Bond girl character-wise since Tracy DiVincenzo in Majesties. Back at the office, Bond of course gets some slack for seemingly returning with no leads and letting the hitman get killed by Melina. But Bond notes that he did see someone pay off Gonzalez, which could have been a payment for killing the Havelocks. Oh, and also, did anyone ever notice the hilarious sounds that the Minister of Defense always makes throughout these movies?
Minister?
Anyway, Bond is off to Q Branch to identify the man that paid off Gonzalez using Q's super high-tech multicolor identigraph with an astounding 64 kilobytes of RAM that is able to display and edit facial features and find a match with someone's likeness, and it's even connected to a printer that prints out real-life pictures of the man they're looking for.
I reckon we're almost there, Pew, apart from glasses. Steel rimmed.
Yep. Octagonal.
I mean, you gotta credit Bond's observational skills. He's only got a glimmer of the guy for a few seconds and he was able to fully identify the guy to the bone. But then again, who the hell has octagonal glasses? That alone was probably enough to identify him. So the guy that paid off the hitman is named Emile Locke, and he is believed to be in Cortina in northern Italy at the moment. So Bond's mission proceeds over there, this time sporting a great bronze version of the Lotus Esprit Turbo, and he meets up with his contact there, Luigi Ferrara. I wouldn't be surprised if the guy was actually called Ferrari. I mean, we did have a Miss Suzuki in the past too. Luigi introduces Bond to another new contact, named Aris Christados, played by Julian Glover, a well-connected Greek businessman that is down in Cortina to fund the training of his protege, Bibi Dal, a really annoying teenage ice skater who wants to compete in the Olympics and has little relevance to the plot. And then there's also her skating coach, Jacoba Brink, a woman who looks like she's never smiled in her entire life. Christados tells Bond that Locke is working for a man named Milos Colombo, a terrible Greek smuggler who is known as the Dove, and he seems to be the main villain of the movie. Bond also spots Melina in Cortina, who is doing some shopping in a local crossbow store. But seriously, why would there even be a store that sells lethal weapons in a winter sport resort anyway? So some goons seem to be out to get Melina, and Bond manages to shake them off, and we got a nice little scene between Bond and Melina.
It was my parents they killed, not yours. Let me out. Driver, stop.
Vai avanti. Presto.
Okay. I'll go back and wait. But not for long.
It won't be, I swear.
Amore, amore.
Again, I'm really starting to warm to Melina here. She just makes for such a colorful character, and I like the genuine chemistry that seems to spark up between the two. It's the exact opposite of the annoying Bibi, who directly after this romantic scene just strolls into Bond's room naked and wants Bond to have sex with her. I mean, Jesus, the girl only got to see Bond for a few seconds, looked at him like, a stranger in his 50s. Boy, I would sure like to get under the sheets with that guy. I'll just walk straight into his hotel room, hop into his shower and let him bang me. Talk about teenage hormones.
Why, I think you're wonderful, Bibi, but I don't think your Uncle Harry would approve.
Him? He thinks I'm still a virgin.
Yes, well, you get your clothes on, and I'll buy you an ice cream.
I love how Roger Moore plays it here though, and I actually rejects a chick for a change. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time he would just bang girls a quarter of his age. Bond and Bibi go to the biathlon, and we are introduced to Erich Kriegler, an East German champion. Usually in the Bond films, whenever there is a huge, muscular, blonde dude, you just know he's a bad guy, and Kriegler is no exception. Bond says goodbye to Bibi and skis into the woods, for whatever reason, and some tension is built here, and as we see, Kriegler is spying on Bond and starts to shoot him from a distance. And Bond looks like he's in serious trouble, especially because we just got to see that this is a brilliant Olympic shooter. Bond is left without his gun and with only one of those key pulls, which again brings Bond down to as few resources as possible. And more goons come in, and all the action that follows is just top notch. Locke also shows up again, and we learn that he and Kriegler are apparently working for the same organization. And there's some brilliant stuff of Bond sneaking away and taking the Olympic jump while being under pressure of the villains, and there's great stuff of the villains chasing Bond on motorbikes with machine guns. And again, the great 80s soundtrack is in the background. And sure, there are some typical Roger Moore Bond film moments in this scene too, like some random skiers falling down together like dominoes, and the drunk Italian guy shows up for the third time in a row. But they do manage to keep the action thrilling and not go all overboard and take away the excitement by pushing all kinds of jokes in your face. There's even a part where Bond ends up skiing in a bobsled course, and inevitably you will compare that to the similar scene in Majesties, but I like this one a lot better. I mean, they actually have guys skiing and driving motorbikes on a bobsled course here. You just gotta give the filmmakers and the stuntman credit for that one. In the next scene, Bond and Luigi drive up to the stadium where Bibi is having ice skating practice. And really though, what's the point of having Bibi in this movie? She has no real reason to be in the plot whatsoever, and neither has Bond to visit her. In the plot there's the excuse of having Bond visit her because he wants to learn more about the East German guy Erich Kriegler, but it's really just awkward to see Bond visit a high school chick who looks like she's on the cheerleader squad for the rest of the year, that has a major crush on a man in his 50s. It just doesn't work at all, and she doesn't really tell much interesting stuff about Erich Kriegler anyway, and her coach calls her off almost immediately too, leaving Bond to face his most sinister adversary yet. Ice hockey dudes. And the fight against those guys is a little bit off too, especially coming after such a brilliant action scene. To me, this might as well have been a deleted scene. The only real payoff to this scene comes when Bond returns to his car and he finds out Luigi is killed and a pin of a dove is left on his body, and that makes quite an impression. Not because Luigi was an interesting character, because he really didn't do much noteworthy stuff at all, but because it leaves you wondering who the hell the villains of this movie really are. In most Bond films we learn who the main villain is very early on, and we learn about their motives or sinister plan along the way. But in this movie we only really learned that there is an important device that went missing, and that there is a guy who we haven't even seen yet called Milos Colombo who is named the Dove, and that Locke, who constantly observes Bond from distances, is presumably working for this mysterious Dove guy. That keeps the plot a bit more intriguing as it slowly unfolds, and I like this fresh take on the storytelling. So Bond goes over to Corfu, a Greek island next, to learn more about this Colombo guy, and he meets up with Melina again. There are some scenes showcasing Greek culture, and I always really like it when the Bond movies do that stuff, because it makes you appreciate the location Bond visits a lot more. That night, Bond visits the casino to have a word with Kristatos again, and we are finally introduced to this Colombo guy, who's also at the casino having a drink with his mistress, Countess Liesl von Slav. And it turns out Colombo actually had Bond's table bugged so that he can hear the conversation with Kristatos, and he has a fight with his mistress that is clearly staged, and she runs off and clearly wants Bond to go after her. Of course, Bond offers to take her home, so Kristatos' driver takes them over to her house.
I'm a night person. I've champagne and oysters in the fridge. Why not come in for a bite?
I won't need you anymore tonight.
And Liesl, by the way, is played by Cassandra Harris, who at the time was Pierce Brosnan's wife, who did visit the set for her a few times, and Cobby joked around a little bit with him that he might end up being the future James Bond one day. Little did they know. Anyway, Liesl is honest with Bond and tells him Colombo wants her to get information about him. Oh, and her nipple can also be spotted in this scene too. No thanks, gentlemen. In the morning, Bond and Liesl spend some time on the beach, when Locke and some other goons show up in beach buggies. Oh, Locke was working for Colombo, right? So I guess they're here to pick up Liesl again? Huh. But they did wear the Dove logo before, and now other goons with the Dove logo show up, so what's going on? Well, it turns out that is the biggest twist of the movie, as Bond is taken to Colombo.
It is Kristatos you want, not me. He told you about himself. He's the one with the powerful connections. Locke works for him, not for me.
So the real main villain of this movie has been Kristatos all along, and Colombo actually turns out to be a good guy. He does smuggle small stuff and all, but not heroin. I love this twist in the movie, especially because Colombo makes for a very likable ally in the same vein as Draco or Karen Bay from previous movies, and Kristatos is a lot more easy to hate as a villain too, because he's been fooling Bond all along. It's a relatively unexpected twist, well, if you haven't read the novels at least, because the twist is directly taken from Risico. So Colombo and Bond team up to raid a warehouse owned by Kristatos on the coast of Albania. This is more elements taken from Risico here. It's another great scene of the movie that has a great big shootout between Colombo and Kristatos' men, and there are some more of those down-to-earth realism moments too, like Bond finding out that Kristatos is smuggling here by tasting opium, and Colombo using his pistachio nuts to spot Kristatos' goons and setting up traps and that kind of stuff. There's also a big mine that can be spotted in the warehouse, suggesting that the mine that crashed into the St. George's in the beginning of the movie was actually planted there by Kristatos. Bond also chases after Locke on foot, who escapes in a car, and he manages to stop him in a really badass way, causing his car to get stuck hanging over a cliff in what is probably the most memorable and badass scene of the entire film.
You left this with Ferrara, I believe.
Director John Glenn and Roger Moore famously debated whether or not Bond should kick Locke's car off this cliff, and Moore originally didn't want to do the kick, but I'm so glad that the director managed to convince him to do otherwise, because it's so great to see his Bond be in a dark and cold-blooded moment for a change. It's a highlight to the movie. And after that, Bond finally does some actual searching for the A-tag. You know, the device that went missing in the beginning of the movie that was actually supposed to be the main objective of Bond's mission. So there is some scuba diving with Melina and some shots that aren't even really underwater, which I really never noticed until my girlfriend pointed it out when watching this together, because apparently Melina's lipstick could not be holding on that well underwater. Girls just notice completely different things in movies, let me tell you. I mean, I can spot nipples that can only be seen for split seconds, easy, but fake underwater scenes that go on for several minutes always went completely past me. Well, what are you gonna do? There's also some underwater stuff of Bond and Melina in a mini submarine scouting out the wreckage of the St. George's to find the A-tag and recover it. One of Kristatos' goons shows up in a really silly underwater suit, but it makes for a unique underwater fight, I'll give it that. The guy gets defeated with a bomb in his suit, and Bond and Melina have the ATAC, but are soon captured by Kristatos, who steals the ATAC, which he wants to sell to the KGB, and Bond and Melina are left tied to a rope behind Kristatos' boat. Once again, it's something taken from another one of Fleming's novels, Live and Let Die, where Bond and a girl are dragged behind a boat underwater, attracting sharks with their blood. I love those little references back to the novels, and the scene is pretty effective. The pair manage to set themselves free by destroying the rope and using the underwater breathing equipment they left there before to stay alive underwater. But Kristatos still has the ATAC, and he's probably on his way to the KGB now to sell it, and Bond and Melina have zero leads at this point. But fortunately there is still Melina's parrot, who has overheard Kristatos talk earlier, and he repeats it. It's another clever twist, which I always really liked. So Bond, Melina, Columbo and his men eventually find out about this Sin Cyril's place, an abandoned mountaintop monastery, and Bond climbs up the place with mountain climbing gear. Yep, no jetpack or watch that has a grappling hook or something. Good old-fashioned Bond relying on his own wits again. And they even had Q show up just before this scene briefly, so they could have had Bond been issued with Gadget here if they wanted, but no, they stuck with the original plan of keeping things as real as possible, and it truly pays off, because the mountain climbing makes for one of the most suspenseful moments in the entire film. Especially when one of Kristatos' goons tries to prevent Bond from getting up, and Bond falls down like a couple of miles, and he has to use his shoelaces to climb back up to the rope again. It's just really inventive. Meanwhile, Kristatos is up there waiting to sell the ATAC to General Gogol, the head of the KGB, returning for the third time in a row in this movie. And the annoying as hell BB is there too, and I still don't have a clue what purpose he truly serves in the plot, other than being a really annoying spoiled brat.
To your room.
You could go to hell.
So Bond manages to make it to the top of the mountain and defeats the goon with a knife. Yep, no laser or space guns in this time, just a good old-fashioned knife. And he gets Melina and Columbo up there too, and they raid the place. Bond and Columbo fight off some goons, and Bond ends up falling down into BB's room and fights Kriegler. And Bond defeats Kriegler and throws him out of the window, and Kristatos escapes with the ATAC, and Columbo also chases him, and it all comes down to a final climax on the top of the cliff where Melina is about to kill Kristatos, and Bond reminds her that revenge is not the answer. Yeah, right, Bond, tell that to Locke. But Columbo kills Kristatos instead with a throwing knife, and General Gogol shows up to pick up the ATAC.
That's Dayton, comrade. You don't have it. I don't have it.
And so the story comes to an end, with Bond just throwing off the ATAC and nobody getting it. And I do wonder how the Minister of Defense feels about that one. So in the end, Bond and Melina are back on her parents' boat, and Bond is about to go out for a romantic night swim and leaves his communicating watch with the parrot, while Tanner and the Minister of Defense contact him and get the Prime Minister on the line so that she can thank Bond personally, and we get a really cheesy Margaret Thatcher impersonation.
Ah, Mr. Bond. I wanted to call you personally and to say how pleased we all are that your mission was a success. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Don't thank me, Mr. Bond. Your courage and resourcefulness are a credit to the nation. Dennis and I look forward to meeting you. Meanwhile, if there is anything I can do for you...
Give us a kiss. Give us a kiss.
Well, really, Mr. Bond.
I never really minded the parody on Thatcher that much. Sure, it's a very cheesy ending once again, but I could always have a smile about it. In my opinion, For Your Eyes Only is one of the most overlooked Bond films in the series, and that probably comes down to it not being a very memorable Bond film. When you look at the villains, for instance, Kristatos or Locke or Kriegler, they're not exactly unforgettable villains you would associate with the classic Bond villains. Coming after a few movies that had an indestructible henchman with metal teeth, following with a henchman that, well, observes and has octagonal glasses, it's no wonder this movie is forgotten a lot faster. And there are no really memorable film sets to be remembered from this movie either, but that's exactly why I think this movie gets overlooked so much, because what we have here is an amazingly well-working, down-to-earth, realistic spy thriller that is right up there with From Russia with Love. No larger-than-life villains with world domination plots, no superhero Bond with all kinds of gadgets up his sleeve, but good old-fashioned espionage. I really like it. It's very rare for a Roger Moore Bond film to be this serious and even dark in places. I love to see Roger Moore's Bond in this setting for a change. The plot has some really interesting twists that keep you entertained and is full of elements taken from several Fleming novels, and while the villains aren't very memorable, a lot of the good guys are. Melina Havelock is easily one of the most interesting Bond girls the series has had up until this point. One who truly makes for a powerful female character who has actual purpose to the story. Even feminists who bash Bond girls for being bimbos should really like this chick. She's just great. Columbo is another great and colorful ally, one of the best in the series if you ask me, and pretty much every action scene in this movie is top notch too, apart from maybe the tacky pre-title sequence with Blofeld being dropped down a chimney, but even that scene had some decent stunt work packed into it. But Bibi is the one I couldn't care less about though, and I think the movie could have easily done without her. It's not exactly Lynn Holly Johnson's fault I guess, as her character was probably intended to be an annoying spoiled teenager and all, but think about it. If Costados was not funding an ice skating teenager who wants to compete in the Olympics, would the plot really have been any different than it was now? But apart from all that, For Your Eyes Only makes for a solid entry in the franchise with a strong plot that even has some major twists and is unpredictable in places. It might not exactly be the most classic Bond movie of the series, but it's certainly a very underrated one that's easily one of Roger Moore's best Bond movies that to me is definitely worth being in or around my top 10 Bond movies.